Just 3 years after Disneyland's spectacular opening day, almost everyone in the world wanted to go there. It also meant that copycats were coming out of the woodwork. While ABC and Disneyland were a team, with ABC providing broadcasts of the enormously popular Disneyland TV show every week, nearby CBS wanted a piece of this lucrative theme park experiment. In 1956, CBS and the Los Angeles Turf Club, now known as Santa Anita, acquired the lease on the Ocean Park Pier, and they proposed to build a $10 million nautical theme park to compete with Disneyland.
What I remember about Pacific Ocean Park is it was like going to the Long Beach New Pike. It was an old beach, pier amusement park, a little better than the New Pike because it didn't really have theming, but it had rides, and that's what was important at that time.
More than 80 special effects men, scenic designers, and artists worked for more than a year on the project. They, like Disney, found corporate sponsors to share the expense of some of the exhibits. To save money, they renovated existing buildings and incorporated 6 of the old attractions into the layout. They copied attractions like Mission to Mars and even had a little mine train type attraction. With Pacific Ocean Park's perfect beach location, it was 90% closer for vacationing tourists and Southern California theme park attendees. In fact, Anaheim was known as the country, and folks chose to visit Pacific Ocean Park more in 1958 than they did Disneyland in 1958.
One of the great things is going down to Santa Monica Beach, and you could sit there and watch the bubble ride going back and forth and see the roller coaster and everything else while you're on the beach, and then nag your parents that you want to go to the park.
With Pacific Ocean Park breaking attendance records and trumping Disney's early success, Walt devised a plan. Since opening day, one attraction just never worked for Walt, the Phantom Boat attraction in Tomorrowland Lake. These free-floating, little gasoline-powered boats just never were able to stay running long enough to make the circle around the muddy, man-made lake. So Walt and his designers planned for a spectacular new submarine voyage. However, money was still very tight, and their investor, ABC, still owned a good chunk of the park. And so Walt called upon Bob Gurr to create a futuristic train that would add some life into the area.
So Walt suggests, let's put a temporary train out there, something for 2 years. And the idea was, let's do a streamlined train. So right away, I got the job. Anything had wheels on the bottom. Walt always said, Bobby's going to do that.
The train of tomorrow that ran on a figure-8 train track in Tomorrowland kind of intertwined with the Phantom boats and the Autopia. Most people don't even remember the Viewliner even being there. It was only there a little over a year.
I sketched up, an overall body concept, knowing that, we're getting into a serious vehicle now. Because remember, it was only Autopias and the antique cars and the omnibuses that were leading up to this. So now I was going to have to engineer something really serious, where we got to come up with a whole locomotive chassis. So I figured, my favorite engine is a 265 Chevy, because it's nice and small and light. The power glide will work really, really nice. I could combine that with a Jeep transfer case. That way I could get a drop drive. So I could run a drive shaft forward and one aft to a front and rear truck. And then, like an idiot, I thought we need all-wheel drive, so I did a belt drive on the front truck and the rear truck, so we had 8-wheel drive, all powered by this 265 Chevy, which was almost more power than we needed, but that was the engine I liked. And then, of course, the biggest problem in the designing a vehicle that's kind of advanced and modern looking is the doors and the wraparound windshield. That would be hopelessly expensive to do. But I thought I like the GM A-body that's used in the Chevy, the Pontiac, and the Oldsmobiles.
An Oldsmobile was cut in half so it would fit on the railway, and Bob Gurr used the siding of the fins from a 1957 Chevy Bel Air to create a wonderfully highly stylized flair to this space-age train.
So I immediately saw what we could do, that we could do a 30-inch gauge, because we could buy wheels and some running gear from a company called C.M. Lovestead up in Seattle. So in those days it was easy to build railroads because there was parts of all sizes for like mine trains. The train I really liked was the General Motors Aero train, and that ran between LA and Las Vegas experimentally for a while. But if you remember what it looked like, it was a really, really cool looking train with this big kind of a horizontal oval front on it, a wraparound windshield, and kind of a tapered roof on it. And I thought, oh, that's the design I want to steal. Starting with the design of the interior first, so it would really look good, chop out the radio grill, swap the die-cast parts on the interior, chop the windshield down by that much and just put a little bead in it. I now had doors, a windshield, and a cab, and the whole deal. And now all I had to do was go find one. Naturally, you know, the company wasn't going to go buy us a new Oldsmobile or a used Oldsmobile. So I went to my favorite junkyard in Glendale called All Auto Parts, and that was my research library. And I could go over and look for the parts that I want, and verified that the Oldsmobile would just be perfect, 54 Olds. So they had a wrecked one there that the cab was good. So I bought that, and then I placed an order for a second one. And a few days later, they said, "Hey, we just got another one. You know, come get it." So I bought the two Oldsmobiles, and that was the start of the body design. The front end, as you recall, was sort of like the GM Aero train. That was all fresh, hammered out of steel, compound, pounded steel. This is the first time I'd done something out of steel like that. And we got a race car builder down in Hollywood to build the nose. That year, in fact, he built the body for the winning Indianapolis race car. So he was doing the IndyCar body and our fuel liners all at the same time, with the basic sheet metal being rolled by California Metal Shaping down in LA. So in other words, see, all these industries are all related. It's like, yeah, you can design stuff at Disneyland if you're an old race car freak, and you know all the people that are building all the race car parts, and you know junkyards. You don't need a college. You just, there's all your sources. When we were building the Viewliner, I really wanted to do the electrical design on the whole train, but since Disney already had its own electrical department, I was told that they'll do the wiring in the cars. But I figured I had access to the wiring diagram for the Oldsmobile, and I knew just enough about wiring for, you know, engines like Chevys and stuff. So I made a wiring diagram just for the locomotive alone. So that'd be like a standalone part just for the engine and controls. Be independent of the wiring for lights and everything else for doors and stuff that rest the car. The electrical department, they're used to heavy lighting, DC lighting for movies. And they needed some electrical power that was 12 volt. And these guys buy 2 electrical alternators and expect to put 2 electrical alternators in the same circuit. I'm not smart enough to know that you can't do that at the time, and that was the source of their design. They also did not use any fuses or circuit breakers in their design, because you usually don't do that around the movies. Anyway, needless to say, in our first couple of days of test and adjust on this Viewliner train, we had all kinds of fires, and the fires make a lot of smoke. But the train started up and drove every day because the part to do with the locomotive was our own wiring. The bodies were built at Standard Carriage Works over in East LA, and all shipped down to Disneyland, painted, stuck together, and put it on the track, and we had a train. Of course, in those days, we weren't training the ride operators as such, because in what we now call test and adjust, it was like, well, get it on a track, start driving it around. And so my boss, Roger Brogy, who's a steam enthusiast, this train was an oddball thing. Here we have this Chevy, this Chevy locomotive with the all-wheel drive. The track is rusty, and I've got lever controls instead of foot pedals for brake and throttle. And I took him for a ride, and I got down on the straightaway, and I hit that sucker, and the coefficient of friction between the wheels that hadn't been run in yet and the rusty rail, that train took off like a shot, and my boss just about jumped out of his skin, because you don't accelerate railroad equipment like that. So he had a hard time getting me to, better keep it pretty slow, Robert. As we added the cars, and as the track began to get the rust off of it, the coefficient of friction dropped way down. So now the Viewliner was as touchy as a steam locomotive on a frosty morning. If you've ever heard a steam engine start to accelerate, you know, it goes chug, 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 chug. That means you got wheel spin. And steam guys are they drive real gingerly because steam has so much power. And the trick is, how do you accelerate non-dragster style and don't lay any rubber? Well, this Chevy with the Power Glide and the track getting smoother every day. About that time, we're training the ride operators, and I only had one guy that understood it because he was a race car driver. How do you accelerate this train out of the station without spinning wheels every trip around? So I learned a lesson on don't ever build something with too much power in it. Opening day, the band is there, getting ready to play. All the press is there, and Walt's due any minute to take the train over to the station. So anyway, here comes Walt, and just then the train burst into a really big fire this time. So the guys raise the hood up, and the smoke is pouring out every which way. And Walt says, "Put the fire out and close the lid. Bobby and I are taking it over to the station." You can imagine the look on the electricians are tearing their hair because they have not solved their problem. I'm not ruffled in the slightest because I know the part that runs the locomotive is not hurt in the fire. And I remember climbing in the cab with Walt, and the guys are still blowing CO2 into it and slamming the lid on it. And it started right up, and Walt and I just drove it over to the station. I pulled in the station and a little bit nervous because I had a ride operator's uniform because we didn't have time to train any of the ride operators. So the trick was, in the middle of the night, they made me a ride operator's uniform. So I looked like a railroad engineer. Anyway, I overshot the station just a little bit, you know, maybe 3 feet. So I started to back up. I put it in reverse and I started back, and Walt rammed his elbow into my arm so hard, and he says, "Bobby, never back up a train without 3 toots." Well, I didn't know I thought trains just went around honking. And I didn't know there was a honk for everything. Like there's a honk for crossing, there is 3 for reverse. So I learned an indelible lesson: do not back up a rail vehicle without honking 3 times. So I got my lesson, the press got their ride, the band played, Walt was happy, and away he went. And when I was done with the whole deal, I drove the train around the back, and the electricians are still standing out the back. I said, "Okay, keep working on it." It was several weeks. They just could not get that sucker to work. So one day I asked my boss, I says, "Do you mind if I make the wiring diagrams and we'll just rewire it?" And of course the boss of the electrical department, who shared the same building, he says, "If Bobby's going to do it," he says, "my men are not going to touch it." So there was another lesson that people are very sensitive to, you know, what parts they're supposed to do on a Disney job. So they just quietly went away. I redesigned it. Our guys rewired it, and we put it back on the track, and away it went. That was another big lesson learned.
This is the Tomorrowland station of the Santa Fe and Disneyland Viewliner, the fastest miniature train in the world, and one of the newest additions to the Magic Kingdom. The streamlined Viewliner will take you on a round-trip tour of both Fantasyland and Tomorrowland, over the trestles and bridges of the Whitewater Rapids and Tomorrowland Lake. The Viewliner, the only train of its kind in the world, speeds past Lookout Mountain, Junior Autopia, over Fantasyland River, and circles through Tomorrowland on its return journey to this depot.
But those early attractions, you know, they were state of the art of the time, but it wasn't long till they started to get a bit long in the tooth, and they constantly were looking at ways to improve them. And they used to do it incrementally, find a new conveyance process, better lighting and sound, and so on. So that was part of Walt's directive, is constant improvement.
While the Viewliner was gleefully riding the rails around the Tomorrowland Lake and past the old steam train, Walt took a trip to Germany.
The monorail got started because Walt and Lily go to Europe a lot. He was driving one day near Cologne, and crossing the road in front of him between the two lines of trees was a monorail train. It just zipped right in front of him. Had he been there a few seconds earlier, a few seconds late, he never would have seen that monorail. He didn't know it existed there. But if you look at Herb Ryman's original drawings of that Herbie did for Walt to take back to New York to raise the money, in the lower right-hand corner you'll find a hanging type of monorail, which is basically patterned off the French Cephage system. That's all I ever knew about monorail. Was I thought they just hang from beams.
Even more bizarre is they had just finished writing the Wuppertal monorail, which is the longest lasting operating monorail in the world. It's been running since 1901. And that one suspends from the track. It hangs from the track, and it's quite a wild feeling because it swings naturally as it goes around the turns. Well, Mrs. Disney didn't like that much, and she mentioned how she was uncomfortable with that feeling. And of course, Walt had been talking about doing a monorail in this park. So she actually said that, well, what if it was on top of the track rather than under the track? And what do you know? They come across a monorail that's sitting on the track. It's almost like it's a written script.
Upon Walt's return, he told his plan to his brother Roy and proceeded with the largest project in Disneyland's 4-year history.
Walt immediately got a discussion going with the Allweg Company in Cologne in Germany. Came back with a bunch of photographs and information about monorail. Sent Joe Fowler over to negotiate with the Allweg Company about getting the rights to build monorail in the United States.
The big, solid, we're going to stay here, we're going to make it, sign to employees was when they broke ground in 1958 for the big 1959 expansion. This is more than a quarter, almost a third of the park was being completely rebuilt from the ground up, and it was truly a sign to those who work there that we're here to stay. We wouldn't be dumping all these millions and millions of dollars into this project if it was going to go away. The star component of the 1959 expansion was the monorail, but that whole area around it was revitalized. There was a creation of the Matterhorn. There were new skyways. There was a revised Autopia. There was the submarine voyage. If you go up to Disneyland now and look at that whole corner of the park, that whole section was completely rebuilt for 1959.
Walt also gave me photographs of and some technical information about the Allweg monorail. So I immediately saw it as an extension of the Viewliner train, because the little Viewliner, we'd worked out a way of body framing, very simple way of doing things, particularly at the Standard Carriage Works over in East LA that had built those bodies. But this would just be a bigger version of it, you know, a bigger version of the same kind of compartment seating, but certainly a totally new suspension system, because I had never seen a train that sat on top of a beam, in which it was called German saddlebag. It straddled the beamway. But I had just enough information that Walt brought me from Germany that I could sort of figure out what the heck we got to do as far as suspension and structure in the monorail. The job was moving really, really fast. And this was all happened right around middle of October of 1958. Remember, we're going to open this attraction in July or August of the following year, which is not much time. Anyway, on a Saturday morning, I was wrestling with how in the world do I hide the beamway passing through the vehicle, because the German train looked like a loaf of bread with a slot in the bottom and just sitting up on a stick. It was really a very blunt, ugly looking thing. Not at all what you'd have in Disneyland. And I thought, how in the world am I going to hide the beamway and the slot in the front of the train? And I thought, you know, Buck Rogers has the right design. You remember, it was like a rocket ship, but a rocket ship that would land on planets, like a little kid's sled with these sled runners. And of course, they had a big fin sticking up out of the top, and I thought, ah, that's it. I could hide the slot by putting these fins at a raked angle underneath this pointed rocket body, put a big wraparound windshield on it instead of using portholes like Dr. Zarkov's version of the Buck Rogers rocket. I'd simply use the same windows that I had used on the Viewliner in the previous year. But instead of having rocket nozzles in the back, we'd simply make the back end of the train look exactly like the front, but the fins would be facing a little bit different. So anyway, the styling of the Mark I monorail was established in about 10 minutes on my kitchen table on a Saturday morning. So I made a rough sketch to see if the dimensions would work, came in and made a rendering of it, black pencil rendering, big picture that illustrated the whole idea. But not yet at that time figuring out mechanically and structurally how we're really going to do it. But in other words, just the idea was enough that I had enough of a picture that I could show to Walt. In a very short meeting, Walt took one look at it, sort of tapped the picture and said, "Bobby, can you build that?" And I said, "Yeah." And the meeting was over. It was like 30 seconds worth. Walt looked around at everybody and the job was approved for go-ahead. And away he went. So now we had a job. So in the next 2 weeks, I made just enough mechanical drawings with 1 or 2 draftsmen helping me to illustrate for the Germans what we were going to do. So then Roger Brogy and myself flew over to Germany within another week or two and spent 1 week negotiating with the Allweg company, who were very, very upset. They'd already made a deal with Joe Fowler that Allweg would be involved in Monorail at Disneyland. Their engineers would design all the beamway concrete structures, working with our engineers at Disneyland. And they assumed that they would be building the car bodies based upon my sketched design, not realizing I was ready to draw all the construction drawings and were ready to build it ourselves using standard carriage works that had successfully done the Viewliner. So you see, the monorail was just kind of an extension out of the Viewliner. In fact, our early drawings were called Monorail Viewliner in the early drawing numbers. Anyway, there was a German car builder there who, kind of a big pompous cigar chewing guy who had a factory in Bremen that manufactured railroad cars. But, you know, typical big old German ugly railroad car stuff. And by the end of the week, this guy figured out that he was not going to get that job. And he was really upset. The Allweg people were very nervous about sending Roger Brogy and Bob Gurr back to California with approval and agreement to that we would engineer and we would fabricate monorail trains, the first production-like monorail ever built that would take passengers, because they only built test vehicles. So I can see this was very upsetting to Allweg to be in that position. But anyway, back in California, away we went. I had 4 guys helping me, and I just designed and drew as fast as I could go and sourced out different parts to come up with this monorail, actual monorail parts. Now this is where the knowledge of being an old hot rodder and a race car fiend and a junkyard addict really came into play, because I'd been there now since late 1954, so now here we are in October of 1958, which is only 4 years time, and I'm designing and going to build the first big monorail in America. It's going to be way up in the air. It's going to be designed by somebody who has no credentials whatever to do it, no engineering expertise whatever is going to get applied to it. We're just going to do it Disney style. It was a little bit scary in that there's things you didn't know, but every day you'd figure out, well, I don't know this, so I'll go find out what I need to know to do it. Now, monorail, you got to remember, is a very trick animal. It sits on wheels on the top of the beam, and it's held upright by wheels on the side of the beam. And that beam has banked turns, 8.5-degree bank turn is a pretty optimum bank. Well, that's great when you're going around the turn, because the train leans to the outside just a little bit, but when you come to a halt, the train is now leaning inboard, and let's say it leans in like maybe 1.5 degrees on an 8.5 degree bank, and that means the train is now tipped over inside at a slower stop speed at 10 degrees. Well, now you have spring forces that are really, really high on the spring rates of the side wheels. So I spent lots and lots of hours doing calculations on spring rates as to what do you got to do to engineer that part of a German saddlebag train. Anyway, we needed a device that could handle attaching like a bogie or a bogie truck with the wheels on it to the car chassis itself. So that meant we had to have the ability to have it turn right and left, have it tilt up and down just a little bit, fore and aft, and also rotate, but have spring characteristics that make it so there's a slight flexibility between the truck or the bogie and the car, but not so hard that it has a bad ride, but hard enough that the train doesn't lean too far. So in other words, much of the running gear was store-bought, modified stuff, hot rod style. And that got us into production real quick because basically I didn't have to engineer basic stuff. I was just designing structures to fit modified store-bought stuff that had already been figured out. So the train got, the fabrication of the train was put at Standard Carriage Works, but partway through the job they were going a little slow. They weren't managing the project the way Disney felt, and suddenly, without any warning, the job was yanked out of Standard Carriage Works and brought to the Disney studio in Burbank and put on a sound stage. In fact, the same sound stage where 20,000 Leagues movie was made, and right over a floor pit where the squid had the big fight. So in other words, here we go from a squid fight to a monorail factory, all in the same building. And so now I had two jobs. I was expected to continue the design of the train and be now the production director on the sound stage. So instead of having a comfortable drafting board and pumping out pictures and driving down to the factory every day, I was on a sound stage with a pile of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and a pencil, and I'm sketching parts on the fly, and I've got a line of machinists making parts. We had to really speed up how we were doing stuff. We didn't have time now to make finished drawings. And we developed a technique where the things were still fabricating. I would sketch them out to a guy and explain it, walk him over to the side of the car, and with masking tape, tape the sketch up on the side of the train and tell him what I needed built and how it was to be built, and here's the dimensions and here's the parts you got to get. And then when you're done, come back in and get in the end of the line, because we had a line of guys, and it was a turnaround thing where each job was finished, the guy would get in line, and then I would keep feeding the head of the line with the next instructions. Totally hybrid way of building things. And with this sound stage, we had a lot of space. We had building 2 trains, so we had 6 cars in there. And Walt would come by every day and come to the door of the sound stage. And I put up a rope to keep people out, because if you worked at the Disney studio and you see a monorail factory, this thing was attracting a lot of attention. So even Walt wouldn't come across that rope anymore. He'd just stand and look. He came by every day. Meantime, I'm writing out requisitions for parts. I'm looking at the catalogs to find the parts I need to buy for this and that. A lot of plumbing parts and bits and pieces. And we had a guy with a bicycle, and he ran back to the machine shop with the requisitions. The Roger Brogy's secretary would call the vendor, and then somebody would go down and pick up the parts and bring it back and deliver it back to the soundstage. So we had this super fast turnaround service, all running in a movie soundstage. And one day Walt came by and he just looked, and they had Mickey Clark, who was a finance guy, with him, and Mickey says, "Hey Bob, Walt doesn't understand how you're doing this, but here, have this envelope." So he hands me the envelope, and they both walk away. Because as you know, Walt never thanks anybody for anything. So as soon as they get away, I open the envelope and there's $1,000 in the envelope, and I thought, woo, you know, that's it. Yeah, he doesn't thank anybody. He didn't say anything, but man, I got $1,000 here. Project, we just kept going, and then the trains got shipped down to Disneyland. The red one first, and then the blue one followed like maybe 2 weeks later. But as soon as we got the trains down to Disneyland, we still had a lot of stuff. We had to, you know, finish refining this and finish trimming that and hooking up a lot of stuff, and then begin to test some things. About 2 weeks before the opening day, which is not much time to test a whole brand new system, why the train was ready to run the first day. And Walt shows up and he climbs into the back of the back car, because we're going to back it out of this little shed we had back up onto the main line. So he wants to, you know, go for the first ride. And the electricians are all standing around the cab where I'm getting ready to drive the train. And the power is all turned on, and when I put it in reverse and then I put my foot on the control pedal, the train moved about 1/8 of an inch with a big lurch, and then there was a loud bang, and then what sounded like a siren. And all the electricians jumped over the berm and disappeared. And it took about a minute for the siren sound to come down. And then they all came back. Well, what I found out was that the torque of series wound DC motors is so powerful that when connected to the short axles that I had done in a hot rod shop, the axles couldn't stand that stress. So I snapped all the axles. And the guys told me, they said, well, didn't you know a DC wound rotor motor will accelerate in probably 2 seconds to infinity and explode? And sometimes the armature parts are found maybe a quarter mile away. Well, see, that's another lesson about learning about powerful electrical equipment. So anyway, every day thereafter, we wound up redesigning parts every evening after test runs, or attempted test runs. The machine shop at the Disney studio would make the parts on the graveyard shift, and the next morning the Disneyland truck would deliver the parts down to Disneyland, and we'd install them, and then as soon as they're installed, we'd resume testing again. By that time, a German engineer by the name of Konrad Deller had come over to help me with it. So we went through like a 2-week period of trying to get the train to run one lap around without breaking down or catching on fire. And that was every day. And in fact, we both stayed at the Disneyland Hotel, and we had dinner every night after a work day. Then we bought a bottle of Christian Brothers white wine. We drank the bottle of wine in the hotel room and agreed upon what we were going to redesign, and then we made the drawings after drinking the bottle of wine, and then calling up to the studio and describing over the phone the parts we want. And they would make them, and then they'd come down in the morning. And that went just, like I say, for 2 weeks. We finally got it to where, I think the day before, 2 days before, we actually got the train to go around almost one lap without anything happening. And there was Joe Fowler again, famous Admiral Joe Fowler that had told me to stop testing Utopia car bumpers. He now issues an order on the radio to me. Robert, I want you to drive slow. And I says, Joe, the resistors in the train that between shunting the current to the resistors and not to the motors is the way you control acceleration in a DC drive. But we can't stay in low speed for very long because the resistors will heat up. And he would have none of it. He said, drive slow. And I knew that the resistors were going to heat up. And I'd made a fatal mistake of mounting the resistor banks in vertical stacks because they fit better than put them in horizontal stacks. Well, what that meant was a resistor is like a coil spring, and you heat it up till it's glowing bright red, and the train is bumping along on the track, and then the coils will start to close. And as they start to close, you're shunting the current very badly, so that all of a sudden much of the current now tries to go to the motors. So Joe was on the back of the train behind a tow bar riding a bogie with a chair on it because he wanted to wanted to see how this thing worked. And in a wink, the train went into full current to the motors because the resistors had now all shorted and were melting and falling into the pine trees and setting them on fire. And so I had no choice but to put the emergency brake on, which was a violent stop with the air brakes. And Joe did not fall out of his chair. He simply stepped out of the chair, walked across the berm, and never said a word, went away. Everybody saw this. So the next day it was like, well, Robert, you drive it at the speed that it's that way we're really going to run it, and we'll do something with the resistor banks. So anyway, that brought us up to the night before, and the train went around one time and did not stop. And I thought because the TV crew would be there the next day for a live TV shot of the dedication of that whole new Disneyland area in Tomorrowland, I thought, I'm parking this sucker right at the platform so that they can get the ribbon cutting, and then I can drive out of the shot and break down, and we're okay.
The Disneyland Monorail, first of its kind in America, a highway in the sky. Yes, it's a gala day here at Disneyland, so let's join the crowds along Main Street, USA, the most famous Main Street in the world, and watch the dedication parade and ceremonies.
We're looking up Main Street from the heart of this magic kingdom as a world-famous figure signals the start of the big parade.
So next morning it's really hot, and like the Viewliner, the costume department made me a ride operator's uniform. So I looked like some kind of a space idiot because this thing looked like kind of it's a tight black uniform with a dumb looking hat, and so we're just waiting for the day to start. And here comes Walt, and he's got some guys with him. And one of the guys turns out to be the Vice President of the United States, and his wife, and the two little girls, and Art Linkletter. And Walt brings them up to the platform to look at the train. And Walt is so proud to show off anything that he's designed with that twinkle in his eye. And he wrote a letter to his friend, Dear Dick Nixon. I have a copy of the letter. He doesn't say, Your Honor, Vice President, what you're supposed to say. He says, Dear Dick Nixon, we're going to dedicate a new train, bring your family out, and we'll give them a ride, give you all a ride. That's the way Walt would introduce something new to Disneyland. So anyway, I had to turn the electric power on in order to run the air conditioner in order to get the cab cooled down because it had been sitting there all morning and it was way too hot to get inside. So then we got in the nose of the train, and Walt introduced everybody all the way around and said something like, well, Dick, this is Bobby. I let him drive the electric trains because I drive the steam trains. And then Walt said, well, give him a ride. So I simply just drove off. I didn't say anything to anybody on the radio. And as we went over the subride, we could see on the platform that all of the Secret Service was on the platform. And Nixon saw this in an instant, and with some horrific four-letter words, began to describe the Secret Service expertise. I was horrified because what this meant was I just now kidnapped the Vice President of the United States. We're on a train that only ran successfully one lap around, and it always caught on fire. We hadn't yet figured out the fire exit procedures on the subride because we hadn't gotten the ladders over there yet to get anybody out. And so we drove around, came back to the station, and the girls said, let's go again, let's go again. And I don't even remember the second lap because as I went through the station, here's the Secret Service. The guys are running toward the train to try to get in it. And as I drive past accelerating, they're running with it, trying to jump in it. Nixon is beside himself with laughing. We drive around. I don't even remember the second lap. I pull into the station, so relieved. The train now has actually done 3 laps in its life. 1 the night before, 2 now, and we haven't even cut the ribbon yet. And we all walk down the down ramp off the monorail platform, and Nixon stops, turns around, looks up there. All the Secret Service are sitting in the train. It was an unbelievable situation, and I thought later, this is the palace guard that guards the White House.
Gliding smoothly along its concrete beamway, this highway in the sky passes above Autopia's 4 new super freeways. The beamway winds through Tomorrowland at various heights above ground level. Its intricate signal system is controlled electronically.
Everybody went away, and the German engineer's standing there watching all this. Konrad Deller, the German. And he's shaking in rage, and he says, "Mr. Bob, in Germany we spend 7 million marks in 7 years, and we do not let the public on the train. You Disney idiots! You get it running one night without catching on fire, and you put your vice president on it." And the guy was serious. I mean, he was really upset. Anyway, later in the day, here comes the TV crew, you know, and this is what we really needed, was the ribbon and do the ribbon cutting. And of course, we had a little problem with the ribbon cutting because the ceremonial scissors wouldn't cut. And Walt reaches around in his hip pocket, and he's got these little scissors. So he just sneaks in there and cuts a ribbon. You know, he always thinks of these things. So I'm driving the train, and the TV people are happy, and I drive the train out of sight, and I was so relieved. I said, we're done for the day. We don't have to do anything now. Train went around, and it was still running. And so Walt says, okay, start giving the press boys a ride. So there was like, I thought 4,000 people lined up, press people, they're gonna go for this ride. And I had one ride operator ready to start training, and we hadn't had a chance to even train the guy yet. And I stayed there till maybe 9 o'clock that night, and I was amazed. That train ran, and it ran, and it ran. It did not give us any trouble. And I remember the very first time that the press was on the train, pulling out of the station and making that right turn, climbing out the beamway. Remember, the beam is kind of white looking, and the tires were leaving 2 black marks right on the top of this looked like pavement. And there was a black family sitting in the front and all jabbering away very happily. And then all of a sudden, this guy yells out, "Oh my God, the man is driving right on the edge." It dawned on me, the guy thought I was steering the train. And when his whole family was in terror that I was going to drive it off the top of the beam. I still laugh when I think of that. That gave me such a laugh. But anyway, by 9 o'clock, I got this other ride operator trained, and I says, "Oh, Ken," the guy's name was Ken Kohler, "you got the train. I'm getting out of here." So went out to my car, and my wife and I jumped in the car, and I headed, just going out the harbor gate, and there was a big blue flash from area of the Monorail. And I said, "Honey, don't look back." I drove home. The next morning I found out, a collector shoe fell off and shorted out picking up the electrical power. And it stopped at the Matterhorn in such a space that they could not pull it into the station. And they also, the emergency brakes were set up, and they couldn't bleed them off to tow it in because the safety people had told me not to put a device on the train that the ride operator could get to release safety brakes. And I said, we have to have that because we got to release them to tow them in. So that meant the mechanics had to go around by hand and bleed down all the brake tanks through all 3 cars. In the meantime, who was in the nose of the train? Walt, and the president of General Dynamics and his family, and a small boy who had to go now. So Walt just told the boy, it's all right. And the lawyers came and said, okay, you can have your electrical switch, bypass switch put in, which we put in that day. But that's how the monorail got, the idea started, how it got built, how it got tested, how it got through its first day. And then from then on, it was a case of improving the design as we went. And the train basically never gave us much trouble for first couple of years. And just blue train went in after the red train, and all of a sudden we had monorails running in America, and Walt was there almost every week with mayors and dignitaries from all over America. He wanted to show off how he was going to solve America's transportation problems with monorails.
The monorail at Disneyland showed millions of people around the world what transportation would be like in large and small communities in the near future.
The monorail was one of the major elements of Disneyland at that time. It was, after all, an e-ticket. It was the top of the line ride at the time, and they had huge lines of people trying to try out this new form of transportation. We all assumed that this was the way of the future, and that'll be really neat when you can get on one of these things and ride across LA.
The monorail seemed to be a real transportation. It looked like a train. I mean, it looked like this Buck Rogers version of a train, but I knew that it could be used in real situations, urban situations or transportation situations, and it seemed like it really was something out of the future now. In old movies, I'd seen monorails or something like them, The Shape of Things to Come, and movies of that nature. So I knew that that was a form of transportation that was talked about, and certainly the way Disneyland presented it was as a prototype of a real transportation system. So I had this image of seeing monorails all over the country and this future world. Back in the 50s and 60s, we really were thinking about creating a vast new future for America with space travel, colonies on the moon, monorails everywhere.
The Disneyland and Alweg monorail system was probably one of the first attractions built anywhere in the country that had real commercial application. After all, it was the very first monorail system operating on a daily basis, built anywhere in the country. The first to cross a public street when they did the extension from the park over to the hotel, across the parking lot. The fact that it ran on electric power, silent and basically non-polluting, way ahead of its time in technology.
When Disneyland opened, there was certainly talk and praise toward Walt about how he had created the first planned community, in a sense, and how beautiful it was, but it didn't really start occurring to him that he could improve how things were on the outside through his dreams and toys on the inside until probably the monorail came along, and that was truly an idea where he saw this can be used elsewhere. This can be used in reality, not just transporting people around like stagecoaches and little boats that fly. This was something that could be used to help real people in their daily life. And that was probably the beginning of his move toward, even though if he didn't realize it at the time, toward trying to create the perfect city.
In 1961, the monorail track was extended to the Disneyland Hotel. The Mark II monorail was introduced to have higher ridership, and thus prove the monorail was more than just a ride. It truly was a transportation method that really could work to solve communities' needs to have safe, reliable methods of moving people. Once again, a TV special and a song, aptly called Disneyland 61, premiered on television screens for all to enjoy.
In Tomorrowland, a monorail which started operations only 2 years ago has already outgrown its original circuit. Its new extension leaves the Tomorrowland area of the park to parallel a modern freeway. Along this stretch, the monorail's passengers can experience a practical application of transportation of the future. Appropriately called a highway in the sky, the new Disneyland monorail system covers 2.5 miles. Not only is the monorail system an entertainment attraction, but its new extension links the park with the Disneyland Hotel.
The Monorail Cafe was opened and became the place to be at the hotel. Walt Disney also worked with the Alweg Company to make a proposal for the Los Angeles Alweg monorail, with ambitious plans to link downtown LA with Anaheim, making it easier for city folks to come out to Anaheim, and thereby loosening Pacific Ocean Park's grip on its location.
It is not impractical to believe that such a monorail system could well be the answer to the growing traffic congestion in our cities.
Well, the Alweg Company, which developed the type of monorail that you see in Disneyland today, proposed to build a 40-mile plus system in Los Angeles, and they put that proposal to officials in 1963. And unfortunately, the government said no, even though they were handed this thing on a silver platter. All they had to do was cough up the roadways to put the monorail over, which is not much space, and they would have had a free system years and years before the subway, but they turned it down. And there's various theories as to why that happened, but unfortunately it just wasn't built.
Why they couldn't build, you know, pylons and put a concrete rail on top of that right-of-way system, and it doesn't look ugly. The monorails are not an unattractive looking thing, especially the Disney monorails were not unattractive. They were just, it was a fantastic idea, and it was railroad engines across the country, but done with a different type of format. You know, that's what was so appealing. And of course the Disney stuff looked, again, Tomorrowland stuff, like I said before, it's clean, it's sharp, it's modern, it's sleek, it has those great lines that came out of the 50s and 60s. There's just something about the way they looked and the sleekness. They were very sexy, you know, and the Disney stuff was very, very sexy looking and not box-like at all.
People had proposed monorails for the LA urban area, and instead they kept going with light rail, which is just railroad trains. Then they were claiming that monorails were noisier than light rail, which is insane. Anyone who's ever ridden on a monorail knows it's as silent as anything. You can stand under a monorail and it'll pass by, and you just hear this whir, and you feel this wisp of wind, and you would barely know that a monorail had passed by. And light rail takes up ground, whereas a monorail is up in the air, and you know, it takes up practically no space except for the posts, and you can do all sorts of things in between. And I've never understood why light rail seemed to win over monorails. Ray Bradbury was a great proponent of monorails for the LA area. And I know it was a great disappointment to him when these proposals would fall by the wayside. And I agreed. I figured it had to have something to do with you know, government corruption or union you know, machinations, because there was no reason to turn down monorails in favor of light rails.
Well, you know, it's really crazy. They spent billions of dollars, and for the same amount of money, they could have monorail all across the Los Angeles basin. And that really got me to thinking. I said, you know, whatever happened to monorails? Whatever happened to this great idea? So I decided to do a little investigation. I spent all of 1988 researching monorails and finding out if they were still around and if they were a valid concept. And what really got me going is when I went into a library and looked through a rail book, and I saw that a brand new monorail had opened in Japan in a city called Kitakyushu, just in 1985. Oh, well, this concept is still valid because the Japanese obviously think it's a good idea. How come we're not building them? So that's where the idea for a group or club, which turned out to be the Monorail Society, started. And we opened the doors in 1989.
I think the people of Los Angeles every afternoon wish that it had a monorail system like that one. But Walt was so intent on building his company in the direction that he wanted to take it, it never became a major effort to create a commercial company out of the monorail technology.
The sad thing about the monorail is that Walt Disney, you know, had a great vision. He wanted the monorail to be the transportation of the future for the United States, or he wanted to at least show that there was an alternative then to what we have. But because the monorail itself became like an amusement park ride, it actually kind of was turned down by a lot of cities. So in a way, it made a negative. Maybe it deterred cities from putting monorails in the cities. So that's kind of one of the sad things about the monorail.
Meanwhile, in Seattle, the World's Fair was being built for 1962, with the gleaming new Seattle Space Needle looming overhead. Construction began on the first Alweg project outside of Disneyland.
Shortly after Disneyland opened their monorail, Seattle got an Alweg type monorail to go to the World's Fair in 1962. Went from downtown down to the World's Fair grounds. And it was a huge success, and it got a lot of notoriety. It was on the cover of Life magazine.
The Alweg Seattle monorail was the direct descendant of the first full-scale test train developed by the Alweg Company in Cologne, Germany. Both of the Seattle trains were built in Germany and were expedited from Bremen by freighter to the United States in January 1962. Together with American engineers and technicians, the Alweg engineers from Cologne supervised the construction of the concrete pylons and beams, their placement, and the installation of the blue and red trains onto the line.
I was lucky enough to attend the World's Fair in Seattle in 1963, I think it was. It ran from 62 to 63, the Century 21 exposition. And I thought, well, this is how life is going to be like in the 21st century. All buildings will look like the Space Needle, that sort of Jetsons look. And I rode the monorail there. I thought that monorail looked a little chalkier, chunkier than the monorail at Disneyland, because the monorail at Disneyland was sleek and aerodynamic and rocket-like, whereas the monorail at the World's Fair was sort of utilitarian and built to hold the maximum number of people. But it was still a monorail. It was fast, it was silent, just like the monorail at Disneyland. And I thought, hey, this is catching on.
The whole construction period in Seattle took just 10 months, and traffic on busy Fifth Avenue, main artery for the monorail line, was only minimally obstructed during this time. The Seattle monorail system did exactly what Walt knew it could. The Alweg monorail was not only a ride, but it was also yet another showcase to the world that monorails were here to stay.
It got the attention of the Japanese, as a matter of fact, and as a result of that monorail, the Japanese bought the technology, and Japan has monorails all over the place now based on that Alweg monorail.
In 1963, Alweg attempted to entice World's Fair planners in New York to add a monorail to the fair. However, they were a German company, and another well-known American company won the spot at the more visible New York World's Fair. The American Machine and Foundry, or AMF company, won the bidding for a suspended beam monorail, and it opened in 1964. Meanwhile, up in Santa Monica, Pacific Ocean Park had seen better days. The trouble was that Pacific Ocean Park was in a run-down, seedy part of town. The nearby streets were littered with bums and winos who accosted customers for money. Local teenagers, whose parents frowned on them going to the park on weekend evenings, told them they were going to movies and snuck down to Pacific Ocean Park.
That part of Santa Monica was kind of a really weird, dodgy, nice, it was, corny area.
In 1965, Santa Monica began its Ocean Park Urban Renewal Project. The entire area was chaos while they built 2 large apartment towers nearby. In short, visitors couldn't reach the park, and attendance plummeted to 621,000 in 1965 and 398,700 in 1966. Finally, at the end of the 1967 season, Pacific Ocean Park's creditors took action and forced the park into involuntary bankruptcy. Santa Monica precipitated the action when they filed suit to take control of the property because Roberts owed them $17,000 in back rent since 1965. The park closed on October 6, 1967.
One of the things that didn't surprise anyone who knew Walt is the steam train that ran around Disneyland, which engine number 1 was patterned after his Lily Bell backyard locomotive. They look almost identical. There's some minor scale differences. Engine number 2 was patterned after a B&O style locomotive built around the turn of the last century. And Walt wanted to own them himself, his own personal property. He paid for their development. He had a right-of-way agreement with Disneyland Incorporated, held by Retlaw, which is Walter spelled backward. And if you worked on the railroad, your paycheck said Retlaw Enterprises, not Disneyland Inc. So the things that Retlaw owned was the name Walt Disney, the railroad. It also had rights with the monorail, and the Santa Fe became their corporate sponsor. And that's how the Santa Fe logo ended up on the Disneyland and Alweg monorail system. If you look closely at early pictures, you see the circle logo of the Santa Fe on the monorail.
The thing I remember about the monorail is when we went to Disneyland, we always camped. My parents always camped because it was a way we could afford to go on our vacations. We couldn't afford to stay in the hotels and the motels. So we always camped by that campground that was right by Disneyland, which I believe was called Vacation Land. And so therefore we would have to walk from that campground to the monorail station. So the monorail was always our first ride. When people would say, what's the first ride you rode at Disneyland? The true answer was the monorail. That was the first thing that took us into the park. So I can remember, you know, the excitement of just the monorail coming because it's going to take me into Disneyland.
The first Disneyland monorail we called the Mark I. It needed a lot of improvement, and they wanted to add a third train, add additional cars, so we redid that in 1961, 62, called the Mark II. And then by 1964, I could find out that there was not a chance to get the monorail design to ever really work well, because there was a lot of design faults in it. So the company said, okay, go figure out a new one. So after a fairly long program of research and testing, came up with a Mark III design, which solved all the original problems that were suffering in the Mark I and the Mark II.
You know, the neat thing about going to Disneyland was as you approached the park, you could see two things from the outside world. One of those, of course, was Matterhorn Mountain. I mean, it would poke out from the very tops of the trees, and even if you were on the North Freeway, the South Freeway, coming up Harbor, you could see the Matterhorn. And even from the 22 freeway, you could see the Matterhorn, and you knew, hey, it's time for Disneyland. As you got closer, you'd see the big marquee, you know, happiest place on earth, so you're getting jazzed up, you're going to Disneyland. But even in the parking lot, the monorail would kind of come out and almost like an arm kind of draw you into Disneyland. I mean, it didn't matter where you were. You could be over by the Disneyland Hotel and one of the hotels over there. There's like Godfather's Pizza used to be there, those types of things. I mean, you don't really get a chance to experience Disneyland on the outside of Disneyland. Normally, you know, you'll get on one of the rides, you're in a show building or something like that, but the monorail was like, look, I'm taking Disneyland with me. I'm leaving the Tomorrowland station. I'm going out across Harbor Boulevard to all the hotel areas. I'm passing over the parking lot. I can possibly see our mom down there in the car. And then it's taking me to the hotel, where even if you aren't a guest of the Disneyland Hotel, you can get out, walk around, and take a look. I mean, and then getting back on it, you'd go back out over West Street and back across the ticket booths and into Disneyland. I mean, that was really, really cool. You know, in this way, you were actually taking Disneyland with you, and Disneyland was coming outside of the berm and embracing the world. And it was like, I can do this. I can bring Disneyland with me.
Interesting thing about Tomorrowland and Disneyland and Disney World's monorails, Walt built these things to show how transportation could be in the future. But an unintended consequence is there was a stigma put on monorails as being a theme park ride. And people, when you mention a monorail, to this day still think about, oh yeah, like in Disneyland, not realizing that monorails are being built as transportation around the world. We're still trying to get over that here in the United States. That's one of the reasons I formed the Monorail Society, was to try and make people aware that hey, monorails are great beyond the theme park and the zoo.
I always felt that if Walt had lived longer, that maybe he could have had some more control on how our future looked. You know, when he died of lung cancer in the 60s, I knew I was never going to smoke because he was just taken from us too soon. And I feel that if he had been around into the 70s and 80s, that maybe we'd still be on the moon. Maybe we'd have our future.
Two separate but interconnecting transit systems will move people into and out of Epcot in speed, safety, and comfort through this central terminal. Both are electrically powered. The high-speed monorail for rapid transit over longer distances, and a concept new to the American city for shorter travel distances, the Wedway People Mover. The transportation heartbeat of Epcot will be the two electric-powered systems, monorail and Wedway, that radiate to and from the transportation lobby.
With the monorail figuring as a prominent part of the transportation of the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. But first, the monorail would need an all-new design.
Here comes a Learjet, and this Learjet oozes up as only a Learjet can, and it has that wraparound windshield. It's white, it's got a drop nose, and it's all flush riveted. I mean, just super, super clean. So I saw that image in my mind. I thought, now that's the image I want for the monorail when people go to Walt Disney World. The first time that they get off their cars, parking lot trains, go up to the monorail station, their first real experience in Walt Disney World transportation is going to be that monorail. And it should have that same feel of having a corporate Learjet ooze up, stop, and you could climb into it. So that meant the wraparound windshield and the flush rivets and the smooth white paint had to be the heart of the design of the Mark IV. And as it turned out, Roman Haas made plexiglass panels big enough that I could have a single wrap windshield that ran all around the whole front of that nose, and then structurally come up with a ultra lightweight body structure, all out of aluminum, really, really light for the size of the train. And everybody just went for it, and nobody argued that we're going to spend extra money on flush rivets, because I said flush rivets, and that's what we're going to do. As you remember, the previous monorails all had rivets showing. So I got away with murder on this super slick, super neat, flush windshield, flush rivet train. Eventually there was 10 six-car trains down there, which was a big change from the original Disneyland two trains with 3 cars each.
While Bob Gurr's new design did in fact look like a modern Learjet, the real thrill was seeing this transportation miracle travel right through the ultra-modern contemporary resort. This was truly the monorail system's finest hour. An audience 6 times that of the original Disneyland opening day watched the 1971 opening of Disney World and were wowed by the monorails traveling right through the heart of the contemporary resort.
All of New York City's town planning work be turned over to the Walt Disney Mickey Mouse organization, because they seem to be the only people in America who are able to get anything done. Now, don't laugh. When you look around at this new town they have built here in Central Florida, you will think he is right. It is the most imaginative and most effective piece of urban planning in America. And that is totally aside from the Mickey Mouse amusement park area itself. It is outside of the park on Disney's own land, which is about twice the size of Manhattan. On this they have built roads, transportation systems, lakes, golf courses, campgrounds, riding stables, stores, hotels, and so on. And they all fit together in a setting of land, air, and water better than any other urban environment in America. We all remember seeing years ago those slick, futuristic drawings saying what the future of the American city was going to be. Gleaming buildings, fast monorails, people in one place, cars in another. Well, this is the future, and none of it has happened. Nobody has done it but Disney.
Well, we helped them with the master plan in scheduling everything, and particularly then in the Polynesian Hotel and in the Contemporary Hotel. We were very, very into those two. But the modern hotel, the Contemporary, was really quite a different approach to a hotel, because what we did is the structure, and then the rooms were done in a factory next door, And then they were just the rooms, all furnished and everything, not quite actually, but nevertheless essentially furnished, were brought up and hauled up and put in a slot. And then the next one came along, up and into a slot, and that's the way we built the building.
From the lobby inside to the activities and surroundings outside, everything is keyed to the contemporary theme, and there is a feeling of now, of today.
In fact, the one thing that somebody didn't figure on is that they could only take those and make sense out of it because you would have had to put them on a truck, and you could only deliver them about 150 miles from there to make any kind of economic sense. Well, and there wasn't another hotel that they were even thinking about that sort of construction. It worked because there was the factory, and well, it wasn't even a mile away. And you bring it right over, put it up, and chunk it in, and it was fine. So it was okay for that one, but we didn't get the economies of having that factory produce other hotels. It just didn't occur. You couldn't keep that going for a year without a place to put the product. And that's what we didn't have down there, and so it just didn't work. U.S. Steel was a good backer of that because the basics were all steel, and they came right along with it, hoping the thing would also fly, so to speak, but it just didn't happen.
We not only supplied the structural steel, the cement and the foundations came from our Universal Atlas Cement division. So come, stay with us at this unique hotel. A remarkable place inside and out. We're finding new ways to build. At United States Steel, we're involved.
No one would ever even attempt something like that. I mean, it was out in the middle of nowhere. It was a wild thing, and I don't think anybody had enough money for that. It was just one of those things that wouldn't happen. No one would have put all their eggs in one basket except Walt. And he believed in it right from the start that it would work. And he had some engineers and whatnot look over it and realize that as long as they were going to do it, they could do the lakes, get the earth out of where the lakes were, get it up and make some sense out of some of the land. And from that standpoint, it worked.
In fact, Bob Hope climbed triumphantly off the monorail and proceeded to do some stand-up in front of Mary Blair's amazing mural to a packed house of park attendees.
Thank you. Thank you. How do you do? How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Bob, ex-Mouseketeer Hope. Boy, they don't build mice the way they used to, do they? Thank you, girls. Wait for me in Adventureland. How about this? Isn't this a beautiful place? And how about that mural? Look at that mural. When John Wayne doodles, he doodles. Hey, what a building. Now I know where the Goodyear blimp goes during the mating season. You know, Walt Disney always believed in the beauty and natural wonders of the world. But he felt as we passed through, we should try to add a little wonder and beauty to it. Maybe you'll understand that Walt's dream was just a beginning. The dream doesn't stop here. This is the start of it. I think you might want to tell your grandchildren you were there when it happened.
The neatest thing, of course, is when it goes right through my favorite hotel, the Contemporary Resort. And even though that was done in 1971, still today you look at it and it's like, wow, this is a really good idea. You pick up the monorail over here, it takes you inside your hotel and you get off. I mean, why don't we have those? I mean, come on. Don't you think that would be a way better way to get from place to place?
In 1978, the monorail once again was used to highlight the future in the design of the all-new Epcot Center. The monorail was extended from Bay Lake and the Magic Kingdom down to the all-new Epcot Center, circling Future World and giving guests the chance to preview all that was to be in store for them inside Future World. Once again, the monorail proved that it was truly a high-capacity transportation workhorse that really was much more than just a ride. In 1983, Tokyo Disneyland opened in Japan, and the monorail once again was the transportation choice to move hotel guests from park to hotel.
I always had a dream of having my own monorail, and I cut a deal with the wife. You know, she wasn't too enthused about the idea, but she wanted a dog and I didn't want a dog, so we made a deal where she got a dog and I got a backyard monorail. Little did I know it would take 5 years to build a darn thing, but I did manage to get one built, and it's in the backyard along with a dog.
I have to give credit to Walt for having his steam train in his backyard, and me being a monorail guy, I thought it would be kind of cool to have my own monorail.
Awesome.
So I got a monorail track complete with the monorail switch.
There's no model for building a backyard monorail, so I basically had to figure out or reverse engineer from what the big boys do with their monorails. I looked at how they worked and how the wheels are attached to the track and tried to figure out how I could do it in scale. And I got a scooter motor and I got smaller wheels, and I put pieces of wood together and put it on a 4x8 beam, and that seemed to work okay. And then I had to figure out how to make curved track, and I said, well, okay, I'll laminate the plywood and I'll curve it. And it was really quite a learning experience to figure out how to do that. But I just didn't know any better to not try and build it. So I just plugged away at it until I had a monorail.
The monorail train needs a little cleaning, but we're currently changing the system from a rideable monorail into an RC type system.
Got it. More
scale monorail that looks a little more authentic to the real big guys.
About 2.5 years ago, it was the red Mark IV. They auctioned off the captain's cabin of it, and by the time the auction completed and going through legal and everything, they felt that they couldn't just sell the captain's cabin because they would have to cut through the ship, and there was legal formality, so we ended up buying the whole entire front quarter of it. It's at my partner's house in Tyrone, Georgia. He has a big, huge barn out there that it's sitting at. And if it doesn't sell, it's going to be enclosed with the rest of the ride cars and all the other memorabilia that we've kept for ourselves.
In 1986, Bob Gurr's original Disneyland monorail was replaced by a new monorail design. And for a few months, both the old and new monorails circled the track.
The way I heard or found out about the new monorails, my daughter was about 2 years old, and we were going to Disneyland a lot, 3 years old or so. And I had an annual pass, and she had either an annual pass or she was still in that 2-year-old range where we could get her in for free. So we would go to Disneyland a lot, and I noticed that one of the monorails had become the new Mark V's. And over the year, I noticed that the other monorails were going away. So I was riding on the monorail once with my daughter, and I think we had actually finally gotten to ride in the front dome area. So, you know, after 30 years of trying, I finally got in. And I asked the monorail operator what's happening to the monorails. I mean, what's happening to the old monorails, the Mark IIIs? And she said, well, the undercarriage is being used for the new Mark V's. They just put the new fuselage on. The old fuselages are being removed and they're being put into an auto crusher. And I just cringed. I couldn't believe that they would take this transportation history and just ram a couple of forklifts into it, lift it up off of the carriage, and then take it off to the auto crusher. So I said, well, are there any plans to save the last one, because I think by that time, Monorail Red was the only one left by the time I raised this question. And the operator said she didn't know. So I made this effort to find out when it was going to be removed. So the plan was to take it off of the carriage in April of 1988. So this was in the fall of '87, and I figured that I had just a few months to work. So I got my geriatric Apple II computer, and I started combing the library for lists of museums, auto museums, the Henry Ford Auto Museum, and for the names and addresses of celebrities. I figured if I could get a celebrity attached to this, someone who really loved the monorail, then maybe I had a chance of convincing people to save it. So I started something that I called the Incredibly Ad Hoc Committee to Save the Last Mark III Monorail. And I decided I would take a cue from Walt Disney, who got an incredible emotional impact with the movie Old Yeller, and I called the Monorail Red Old Red. So the slogan was Save Old Red. And I sent out press releases, and I sent out letters to people such as George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Michael Jackson, and other celebrities in the hopes that I could convince them to attach themselves to the project. Nobody really wrote back. I'm certain they got all sorts of requests all their lives. But I wrote to the Disney executives too, making my position known, and several of them wrote back to me and let me know that they would be perfectly happy to save the monorail fuselage if we could find an appropriate venue. I was in the Orange County Register and mentioned in other newspapers around the country. So I got good publicity, and there began to be this groundswell of support, and people began writing to Disney, pleading with them to save the monorail. And time began to approach, and I was in touch with some people at Disneyland that were keeping me informed about what was happening. And then they finally told me that April 18th was the last day, April 18th, 1988, last day for the monorail. And 2 days before that, a few days before that, I had sent out a final press release saying, it's going to the crusher if we don't do something. And I don't know what happened, but 2 days beforehand, I was told that they've decided not to destroy the front end of the monorail, the first car, the fuselage of the first car, that they were going to remove it carefully and put it into storage. And for me, that was the ultimate victory. So on that day, I went to Harbor Boulevard, the Harbor Boulevard overpass, where you can see, if you walk out onto the overpass, you can see the monorail roundhouse. And I brought my trusty old video camera, and I videotaped them removing the monorail front end with a crane. And it was a great feeling to see that they had rescued it, and I could tell that they were being very careful. It took about half an hour for them to lift it off entirely and lower it down. So I knew that the shell had been saved, and I figured my work is done.
When they finally got rid of the older monorail, it was sad, but what the neat part about it is that the Mark III chassis are actually underneath the new monorails. So they have different body shells, but the old chassis that Bob Gurr built we're still running on the same monorail. It's just got a different body on it. So that's kind of a neat thing.
Time passed, I was living my life. And in the fall of 1989, I received a letter or a phone call, I'm not sure which, from someone at Disneyland, letting me know that the monorail fuselage had been converted into a street-ready vehicle called the Monorail, and that they wanted me to be at KCAL Channel 9, which at the time was owned by Disney, and receive a presentation. So we went out there in the morning, early in the morning. This was for Stephanie Edwards' television show, and the show opened with her arriving at work in the monorail, the Monorail, and stepping out and introducing the show. And about halfway through the show, they went out to the back lot, and there was the Monorail. It looked really great. It had been completely restored to perfection. Every little dent in the stainless steel that I remember seeing over the years had been delicately hammered out, or perhaps they'd put in brand new panels, but it looked great. It looked like the monorail I remembered, and it was ready for their 35-year celebration.
Victor, being the lover of Disneyland that he is, started an incredibly ad hoc committee, you say?
Yes, incredibly ad hoc. It was a committee of one, just me alone with my computer and a mailing list that I made up from looking in the newspapers and telephone books for museums that might be interested in saving and preserving the monorail.
So you knew that this car was about to be retired?
Yes, I had been riding on the monorail. They had converted 3 of the 4 monorails at Disneyland to the new Mark V monorails. So I asked the driver, what's going to happen to the old Mark III? They said, well, they'll probably demolish it and convert the undercarriage to the new Mark IV. And I thought that this would be a terrible thing to happen to the last bubble-topped, stainless steel-sided, fire engine red monorail of its kind. It had a very Flash Gordon 1950s futuristic look. And I decided that I would try to find a way to preserve it.
This has been great fun. We don't get to go on the road now. It's back to carpooling with somebody else. Thanks, gang. It was a great trip to work.
And it was great to see the Monorail restored, and it set off, it opened up. It was the first, I couldn't call it a float, but it was the first thing to roll through in the 1990 Tournament of Roses parade, and that was a great feeling, watching the parade and seeing that happen. People that might never have seen it again or never seen it in the first place got a chance to see it roll through their town, which is a really great feeling. So I'm glad it had that last chance to be seen around the country.
In 1998, when the rocket rods opened as part of the new Tomorrowland, when you walked into the queue area, there were several attraction vehicles. There was a pair of people movers, which I bought one. My friend Kevin bought the other one. And there was also a couple of rocket jets and a Skyway and whatnot. But right when you walked in, that was Monorail Red. The Mouserail was then reborn, so to speak, repurposed, and put into this queue area for the rocket rods. So it was all painted over with this blue coat, such as the people movers were, and the other ride vehicles, and they're going to give it kind of a neon museum kind of look. But the Mouserail did end up in the rocket rod queue area.
One of the featured things about Walt was his interest in steam, and he was the steam guy with the little Lily Bell train. But Walt always said, I'm the electric guy, the monorail guy. We have a special event here today with featuring the original monorail at Disneyland from 1959. This is a very special display of models even from Walt Disney World trains, the later ones. This is the original drawing that I made that John Hinch put the color on in order to show Walt what the new monorail would look like. Walt took one look at that design and the project was on, so we started designing and building it. Some of these are the memorabilia that collectors now are collecting of all kinds of early monorail stuff. There's been a number of posters made that tell some of the story of the design of the monorail. Actually, right here, this is the last piece living on the planet of the original monorail. That came right off the original monorail with the Santa Fe logo, Santa Fe Disneyland Railway. And this ran for a number of years on the train until we took it apart and replaced it with a newer train. We have more artwork and display to do with monorails. Over here behind this tabletop setup, you'll see the opening day. And that's Walt Disney with the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, and his wife and the two girls, and getting ready to cut the ribbon to dedicate this train. Obviously, Walt was so thrilled to have the first monorail in America, he asked his friend Dick Nixon to come and help him dedicate this train. There's an additional monorail display here. We have models that were originally made by the German company, Schuko, making these models, which are very prized collector items now today. One of the folks here was a collector that set up a running train of these monorails with the blue train and the red train. There's additional information through the different models from 1959 all the way up to 1991. Then here we have two extremely accurate models of the original Mark I monorails in the configuration that they were used in the first couple of weeks in Disneyland.
And what I have here is the 1959 replica that Rich Osmiller and I patterned for master replicas for Disney. And it was really interesting to go about learning all about this particular piece. I contacted anybody and everybody I know and got a hold of a gentleman who actually used to be an Imagineer named Alan Jacobson. A fantastic gentleman and a very good friend of Tony Baxter's, childhood friend as a matter of fact. Now, Alan used to live down the street from the monorails and used to ride his bike along the Beamway every day following them. Rich Osmiller and I had done several models for Disney, and they approached actually Rich, saying, you know, our next project we'd like to do a model of the monorail. And my understanding is, as Rich tells it to me, is they contacted him, told him that this is what they wanted to do, and they didn't know who to turn to. And Rich, of course, knew that I was a fan. I'd already started a AutoCAD drawing of the monorail at this point, and I'd actually made a few models of it, but kind of crude. And they contacted him, and he contacted me, says that we could do this. And so we proceeded to do so.
We're looking at the red monorail, and I think it's a 1955 Chevrolet color. I really like it because it's got a lot of orange in it. But the center unit was the same as the center unit on both of the ends, and then these were like tacked on. So when this was all made up and it went together, it had the look of the 59 monorail.
It does have the correct flooring. It does have the correct driver's seat. It does have the correct console. It has the trim. The seats, pretty much the interior of this thing is per spec. It is exactly what it needs to be. And ironically enough, or incidentally enough, so's the exterior. The exterior of this is almost dead on.
But when you got into the front of this thing, it was a wonderful feeling to go around on that track, and that was a reduced size track. It didn't go all the way over to the hotel. But it was very futuristic, and you felt like you were something in the future, and you say, why couldn't something like this be used to move people around?
As we were building the train, I would send pictures off to Bob Gurr and say, how is this? You know, from beginning to end, Bob knew what was going on. And that really helped, because he would critique it, send it back, fix this, do this, and we just went back and forth, and that's why I say I broke his ear.
And Bob Gurr would make sketches of the interior, because no blueprints existed. Made sketches of the interior. He'd send them to me, I'd resize them, send them to Will. So the interior on this monorail, I think, is perfect.
If you look closely, you'll see it says WBRA, which of course stands for William Babington Richard Osmiller, which we're very proud of our little logo. And it's just a wonderful little train, and we got a chance to have a little spot on there.
These models are extremely beautifully detailed in and out. These are going to be sold by Disney this summer as very, very high quality tribute back to our old original monorail that started in 1959 at Disneyland.
In 1995, one of Disney World's monorails was sold to the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, and the Las Vegas monorail system was born.
By 1990, the Walt Disney World trains had run their 20 years, and they were taken out of service and were replaced by brand new trains built by the Bombardier Company, but patterned generally after the original Mark IV train design of 1971. In the meantime, some of the used Mark IV monorails from Walt Disney World went to Las Vegas to run for a number of years between the Bally's Hotel and the MGM Hotel. So oddly enough, there was a link from Walt Disney's original idea of monorails in America, made that long route to Florida, and then those trains come back into the desert in Las Vegas. So that was the continuity of what Walt wanted now lives through that long circuitous path.
Around the globe, monorail groups such as the Monorail Society keep the flame alive and spread the word about how wonderful monorails really are.
What I really noticed is people truly enjoy the ride experience of monorails beyond just getting them from point A to point B. They love the view, the way the thing kind of flies through the streets, and they can look down and see what other people are doing. And one of the great beauties of the monorail is you can run red lights. Some of the other transit systems being built in the United States, like light rail, they have to stop for all traffic and for signals, and not with a monorail. You just go right through the intersections, and there's always kids with their faces up against the window and enjoying the view. And I'm a 53-year-old kid, and I got my nose up against the window too.
Alweg's 1959 excursion to Disneyland supplied Alweg's critics with the argument that the monorail is kid stuff for theme parks only. An argument that to this day is used by monorail opponents, and that keeps resurfacing in reports by journalists and other self-proclaimed experts. On the other hand, Alweg's Disney Adventure introduced the Alweg concept to America, where technical innovation was and is always received more enthusiastically than in Europe. Despite the murmurings of monorail critics, the Disney monorails quickly became an American favorite. Today, Disney is already operating the 6th generation of monorail trains. They still follow basic Alweg technology, but have been modernized continuously. Disney also introduced the beautiful arched beamway that makes the classic Alweg monorail structure look even more elegant and fragile. Disney's monorails in California and Florida are indeed theme park monorails. Yet they daily log miles and carry numbers of passengers that are equal to genuine rapid transit figures. This service record counters all expert criticism that tries to denigrate monorail technology as a non-serious transportation concept. And what of the New York World's Fair monorails? The monorail cars were last seen in Hitchcock, Texas in 1997, stacked in a pile next to Highway 6. Today, the Disneyland Hotel is still served by monorail, and it continues to be a fascination for many people. And both the Las Vegas and Seattle monorails give hope that monorails will one day serve as the transportation choice of major metropolitan cities in the years to come.